Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first lecture of October. I should mention the first lecture of this academic year. I'm Mustafa Aksoy. I'm the chairman of Anatolia and also the host of tonight. First of all, because there are so many new faces, I should mention a little thing or two about Anatolia. But first of all, I'll just mention the program, what we'll be doing tonight. First of all, after the opening, I shouldn't use first of all so many times. After the opening, Ehsan will speak about his subject. That will take around 40 to 50 minutes. Then we'll take a little break, around 8. Afterwards, we have a Q&A session, so you can ask anything you want. For that, we have two digital materials, so if you have any questions in the lecture, in the first part, you can just send them in through svanatolia.nl/questions or through our app. There's a button for that, for the question part, and you can send them in. After we have those questions, then maybe if we have time, we can ask throughout the room. And I hope to finish 9-ish. I know it's a little bit fake, but it depends on the questions. First of all, about Anatolia. Well, we just started 20 years ago. It's almost our 20th year. We do a lot of things for a lot of purposes and lots of people. First, if you want to look at our sponsors, it's a great big company. So if you want to work there, or if you're interested in working there, just become a member and just get more possibilities in those kinds of places. We also have some upcoming events, like a dodgeball on the 1st of November and a trip to Istanbul, which you can apply till the 7th of October, just 3 more days. And we have many more upcoming this year. So if you want to have people walking in my presentation, but if you want to see more about Anatolia, you can sign up with my colleagues. They have a little card with them. If I'm correct, you also got some forms for that cause. You can just give it to them if you filled it in. But that's it for my part. I'll be seeing you guys in the break part. I don't really think there's really need for a little bit of introduction, but I'll still try. Mr. Masood is a little bit tired. He's a scientific journalist and works for a couple of research groups in this area, and also writes for some scientific magazines. I'm really bad at names, so excuse for that. And he's here for his talk about his book, Islam and Science. We're going to see it afterwards. I hope there are some people who read it, so we can ask about that subject. I'm really taking a long time. May I have an applause for Mr. Masood?
Thank you, Mustafa, for that very kind introduction. Can everyone hear? Yes, just about good. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here for a number of reasons. First of all, I think I was trying to count you. I went upstairs and I was trying to count how many are down here. I think this is probably the biggest audience I've ever had for my book. So give yourselves a round of applause. I think what's also extraordinary is that I've written a few books now, and this particular one was published about 10 years ago. So the fact that it's still being read, I think, is also it's extraordinary in many ways. It's not least, of course, because of the subject matter. So that's the kind of good news. The bad news is that there was a Dutch edition Mustafa, can you pronounce it properly? Islam, what's it called? The Dutch edition?
Wetenschap en Islam.
So,
you can find it on bol.com.
Except that it's out of print and it costs €60. So I don't think I'll ever see any of that again. But anyway, it's really great to be here and to talk about. The book is now in the English edition. It's in its second edition. So we did a second edition, which is in fact, I would say, better than the first for a number of reasons. It's up to date. I've written a new introduction, and we found out some new material which we've added to the second edition. So that's, if you're going to look at it, that's probably the one to get. So just before I start, can I get a kind of quick show of hands here? How many of you are studying science here, or engineering, technology? Okay, and how many of you? How many doing humanities, arts, social science? Okay, so majority of you in the science world. And how many from this university? So majority of you from this university. Okay, well, welcome back. All right. So I'm going to, as Mustafa said, I'm going to speak for about maybe 45-ish minutes. I think if anyone has, ideally I'll speak and then, we can do the Q&A at the end. But if someone has an absolutely burning question and you simply cannot get it out of your system, you have to ask it. Then, sort of wave your hand like this and I'll stop and see if I can do it. Because it's probably better to get questions early rather than sometimes wait. But, ideally we'll go through the whole presentation. But if someone has an absolutely burning question and you simply cannot wait, then please do ask. Okay, so let's get going with the presentation. So we're going to start with a little quiz. Any idea what those three different manuscripts might be? Somebody? Anyone? Someone says the Quran. One of them is the Quran, but two of them are not. Anyone?
The Bible.
The Bible. Ooh, yes, that's right. Can you read Arabic?
No, I can read, but not read Arabic.
No, okay, yes, no. That's right, yes, one of them is the Bible, yes, that's right. And the third one is a scientific text, is a scientific manuscript. That's the one on the left, here. So, oops. This one here is a copy of Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, probably from 1200s. But you can see it's decorated in that very ornate way where you see a lot of Arabic manuscripts. And a lot of people these days looking at it would think that it might be a more sacred text. It might be a page from the Quran, in fact, but this is in fact a scientific text, and it's the Canon of Medicine by Ibn Sina. And it was originally written in the 10th century, but this particular manuscript is a bit more recent than that. This one here is the Book of Psalms. So yes, well spotted. And this is from 15th century in Egypt. And the last one here is in fact the Quran, and that's 14th century Egypt as well. And I think you can already sort of start seeing that context is really everything in the story that I'm going to try and tell you, or the different kinds of stories. That, we are right now in a world where the European languages is how we learn and we do things, and we discover and we invent and do our scholarship and come to university. And it isn't just, of course, here in Europe or in the Netherlands, but also all over the world. People of your age and those who are going to come up. Very much all scholarship these days is in European languages. But the period that I'm going to be talking about was a very different period when most advanced learning, most innovation was done in Eastern languages, and not only in Arabic but also in Persian. And in other languages in other parts of the Eastern world. And the Western world was in a different sort of place. The Western world was, had several sort of centuries of advancement, but they were slightly stagnating. And I think there was clearly problems, particularly in terms of dogma, problems of literalism, problems of what we might today call extremism. And it was the nations of the East which were much more dynamic and much more exciting and much more interesting. But they were writing and publishing in the languages, which these days, of course, are languages or regarded as languages of the East. So for the few of you who, this is a kind of just 4 or 5 minutes, this is like a whistle-stop guide to Islamic history, and in terms of how it relates to scientific development. So on the left-hand side there, that's the Christian era. You've got the birth of the religion, you've got the death of the prophet, and of course the beginning of the bifurcation of all the different Islamic sects that you see today. I think there are literally hundreds of them now. They were, of course, the first two were the Shi'i and the Sunni, and they've now become, much, much more diverse. We are an incredibly diverse community. 3444 is the period. We don't really know exactly when, but that's the kind of period when the Quran is codified. It was very much memorized. It was part of the oral tradition. It was written in lots of different fragmentary ways, and then of course it's brought together as a written text. And then 661, so just a little bit more than half a century after the beginnings of the prophecy, you see the first of the many dynasties, and there are lots and lots of dynasties which go all the way up until 1924. And some of them are standalone and some of them are overlapping. And of course, when any civilization has imperial ambitions, and of course this was no different, there are certain things that have to start happening quite quickly, just for all kinds of reasons. And one of those things, of course, is a common language. It's very important when you're setting out, if there are any empire builders amongst you, when you start your empires, you will need a common language quite quickly. And Arabic, of course, becomes that common language. And it is in the Umayyad period when that starts to happen. Coinage, of course, when you're a bit like the European Union with the euro, when you want to trade across borders, you need to be able to travel freely, you need to have freedom of movement, you need to have a common currency. And so, the common currency begins and freedom of movement begins to start. The capital of the first of the Islamic dynasties moves out of Medina, and it moves to Damascus. And of course, the faith then starts to spread. And then really I've only got two slides here, which is kind of more historical. The next of the big dynasties is the Abbasid dynasty, and they overthrow the Umayyads in 751. They move the capital to where they're more comfortable, which is Baghdad. And really, the period that we're going to be talking about, where there is the most discovery and invention, is in this period. I would argue. It happens later on as well, but there's such a concentration of stuff that's happening. Hospitals and libraries and observatories and so on. And there is also an inquisition, known in Arabic as the Mihna, when ordinary believers felt that they were just simply being forced to think in a more rationalist way, and they didn't like it, and they rebelled. What's up?
I'm just going to turn the volume a little bit
Oh,
up.
is it a little bit too... Okay.
Can you maybe hold it
Do
towards you?
that? Yeah, like a pop star.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Pop stars don't wear ties. So, anyway. And then you've got the first of the Abbasid dynasty is slightly closer to the family of the prophet, but then you've got the first Shi'i dynasty. The Shi'is have had to wait a long time before they get their empire, and the Fatimids of Egypt, of course, is the first great Shi'i dynasty. And out of that, you get Al-Azhar University in Cairo. Anyone here been to Cairo? Anyone been to see Al-Azhar University? This is the first of the big universities, one of the very early ones, and contemporaneous with some of the European ones. And you get, again, more scientists and more discovery and more invention. Those last 2 centuries, of course, of the Mongol Empire, and of course it's known partly these days because of the sacking of Baghdad, but actually there was quite a lot going on around that time as well. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the things that happened in that period. My own first degree was in physics, so this is, for me, it's a bit of a busman's holiday, really. It's a slide of the observatories that were established in the Islamic world during that period, sort of 700 to 1300. And if you can, it's a world map, and you can see, they are spread pretty much east to west. And these are just the big ones. There were many, many smaller ones. There were ones in people's houses. They were in their lofts. There were so many mosques. There hasn't really been an inventory done because mosques used to double up, as many people know. They would double up as places for stargazing because Not so much the imam, but the muezzin in the mosque would often have an interest because of the need to compute the times of prayer. But there would also be another job in the mosque, which would be the astronomer's job. And sometimes it was called the muwakkit, or the timekeeper. Sometimes it was called the astronomer. And so if you add in all the mosques, then this image would be much, much busier. But these are just the larger, state-funded or philanthropic-funded observatories in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Iran, in Central Asia, in India, and so on. Now, the interesting thing, the sad thing, is that how many of these do you think still survive? Anyone? One. That's one too many. 0. None of these survived. In one or two places, they've created monuments to where they are, but none of them survive. And one of the reasons they don't survive is because they were funded in such a way that they were often the pet projects of specific particular rulers. And there was never any sustainability or perpetuity for their funding. And this, of course, is in contrast to hospitals, which have survived. And the reason why hospitals have survived is because hospitals were funded in a different way. They were funded as part of the okaf, which was a kind of specific religious form of funding. And they had a more sort of sustainable model. So even in those days, there were some parts of sort of science and technology and engineering which were seen, something that could be backed, but others which didn't really survive. So this is kind of really quite sad in a way that they didn't. That is the Ulu Beg Observatory in Samarkand. So this is the spot, and it's now been it's a monument. Definitely well worth seeing if you're going there. Other things that happened, of course, is there was lots of cartography that was happening. Anyone know why there'd be an interest in cartography, map making? Who would need a map?
For travel around.
Travel around. That's right. Yes, and of course we're not talking EasyJet, are we? We're talking about people who need to travel for rule. Often people would travel. The rulers would, the governors, and so on. And so, if you need to be able to know what's in your area, in your territory, you need maps. And so, it's only more imperial nations or civilizations that would do map making. And of course, the Islamic civilization was no different. And this is a very early one. I mean, I'd say it looks like a little bit of a mess there, but believe you me, there's some method in the madness. This one's a little bit later. This is from Al-Biruni in the 11th century. And I'm just going to blow it up here. And you can get a little bit more of a sense of what the ambition was. You would, only if you think you're going to go to China or you're going to go to the Persian Gulf or Oman or other countries, would you actually bother to put those into a map. And this was an early map from the period of Al-Biruni. Could do with some drawing skills, I guess. And so yes, and back to hospitals. This is there was lots and lots of us. Lots of medical science. I think we're in a medical faculty, so I suppose it's quite prescient. Some of the things, apart from discoveries in surgery, for example, one of my favourite examples of things that happened in ancient times was the idea of creating wards, and the idea that you would organise your patient care according to different ailments. Because if you like, even pre this period, if there was a place for ill people, you'd sort of just dump them all together. But as medicine became increasingly more and more specialised from around the 13th century and onwards, the surgeons, the physicians, and the managers of the hospitals realised that it's better to have people with specific ailments in specific areas and to sort of organise them according to wards. This is a model. The unfortunate thing is that a few of these hospitals still survive, but this particular one was destroyed quite recently. I was in Egypt reporting on this because there's a lot of unplanned development happening across the developing world, and Egypt, of course, is no different. And even though it's known that this was the site of a famous hospital and a madrasa attached to it, but developers had gotten hold of the land and they were building a sort of big high-rise. And they were literally, as I was standing there were these kind of big cranes, and they had those sort of giant balls, and they were wrecking and just running into the place. So we managed to get some footage in my magazine before it went, but a lot of that now, unfortunately, quite recently, has been destroyed. So I'm going to talk about a couple of individuals in a little bit more detail. One of those is going to be Ibn Sina, who is the author of this book here called The Canon of Medicine. And then I'm going to talk about, so he's sort of one, if you like, scientist slash philosopher slash physician. And then I'm going to talk about one patron, and that is the Caliph al-Ma'mun from the Abbasid period. And part of the reason for that is that when we talk about science and scientists, we sometimes forget that, you know, scientists need patronage. You know, these days it's the state and private sector. Some of your lovely sponsors up there, you know, they fund a lot of science. In fact, more than 2/3 of science spending comes out of the private sector these days. Back in earlier times, it would have been philanthropists or the royal courts. There wasn't really much of an industry in that sense. And so I want to talk about al-Ma'mun as a big patron, as a big funder of science and why he did it and some of the implications of what he was doing. But we're going to start with Ibn Sina, who's the author of the Canon of Medicine. Any of the medics come across his book? I'd be surprised if you would. No? Yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all. If, however, you were a medic in earlier times, there he is, by the way. It's a nice impression. If you were a medic in earlier times, this would have been your textbook, and it is still in print. Still in print in lots of different languages. The one that I have at home is in English. The first Latin translation was in 1187, and it very quickly found its way into Europe. When it was taught, it was the main medical textbook in the universities of Bologna, in Padua, in Paris, in France, in Siena, in Italy. And the last known translation was 1674, so it had a pretty good run. And it really only went out of fashion with the advent and the birth of more modern, more scientific medicine. And there were at least 60 editions between 1500 and 1674. If you're interested in learning about this more, there's a reference. I've got some references at the end of the slideshow. But Nancy Ceresi is the historian of Avicenna in Europe. Nancy Ceresi, she really is like the world expert and has spent a lot of time just doing lots of very basic detective work and trying to find where this book was published and who read it and who commented on it and where it was taught and for how long. And this is what she's found so far. And my own sense is that this is the tip of the iceberg. I think the real numbers are higher than that. But so that's a little bit about the book there. Let's talk a bit about Ibn Sina himself. So he was a Muslim. He was born in what now I guess would be Afghanistan. Believed in God. He was born into a Muslim family. He believed in the Prophet Muhammad as the last prophet. But in other ways, he was a little different to what most Muslims like us today and elsewhere would be. First of all, of course, he was an experimentalist in times when this wasn't really the thing. That, you know, people who were working in science and medicine weren't really experimentalists. There were lots of people who had ideas, but he was someone who wouldn't be reluctant to come to a conclusion about something unless he'd actually experimented, formed a hypothesis, tested that hypothesis, done some experiments, came to a conclusion. So he kind of followed what today we would call the scientific method, you know, deductive or inductive reasoning, but he would do it with his own bat. And he came to some conclusions as a result of that. So one of those was that he felt that there are such things as the laws of nature, like gravity, for example. He didn't discover gravity, he probably didn't know what it was. But he realized that there are certain inviolable laws which these days we know you cannot. It's not possible to break unless you come out into a new scientific paradigm. And as a kind of corollary from that, he started questioning the idea that can there be miracles, for example. You know, if there are people who have, you know, there's even today, but back then even bigger, there was a big industry of faith healing. And he would question the faith healers and he'd say, where is your evidence? How do you know that if you're doing this faith healing, you're charging lots of money and you have loads and loads of people who are coming to you, you know, someone's got a cold or a flu or someone needs kidney dialysis or whatever it is, and they're going to faith healers, and he would question and challenge these faith healers and say, I think, and he would often say quite, you know, rude, use quite rude language, say that I think you're all charlatans and you're not really to be trusted. He then went a step further and, you know, said and wrote that, you know, the standard belief that we're all taught when we grow up as younger people is, not in my case anymore, is that when we die there is an afterlife and a day of judgment. There is bodily resurrection. We die, and then all of our parts will somehow miraculously all come back together again, and then we stand before God on the Day of Judgment. And he questioned that. And it's kind of interesting because he didn't question it theologically, so he's not necessarily a theologian, but he just questioned it scientifically and said that how is it possible? He just asked that question. He said, how is it possible that once you have died and your body starts to decompose and, ashes to ashes and dust to dust, how does all that kind of suddenly swing back into action and recreate you, as a human being walking in some other place? And of course, he got into lots of debates with more, traditional, more mainstream theologians about this, and the records are really quite interesting, and I'll come to one of those in a minute. But for me, the really interesting thing was that nobody shouted at him, "Oh my God, you're a heretic! I think you should die," which is sort of the reaction that we would get now by asking some of these kinds of questions. There was definitely more space for what I would call heterodox ideas or different sorts of ideas. And he is by no means the only one who was doing that kind of questioning. So we talked a bit about the canon of medicine. So he had his critics, of course. Who's seen this book? Anyone seen this book? 1, 2, I thought so. Yeah, it's still in print. It's one of my favourites too. This one's published in Cambridge by the Islamic Text Society, translated by Penelope Johnson. And it's a really interesting book in so many ways. First of all, it is the basis of so much faith healing and so much traditional healing, and it's a 14th century book which is still being used today. I think that's in its own way is quite remarkable. So this chap, the author, is a Syrian theologian, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, and he comes a few centuries after Avicenna, after Ibn Sina. But he, of course, is quite skeptical, of the modern medicine, and he writes in this book that physicians have nothing to repel these illnesses and their causes any more than they have to explain them. And his whole belief is that medicine is more a state of mind as opposed to something that's physical, and that's a kind of quite important distinction between his way of healing and more experimental or empirical ways to heal. And so in that sense, praying and following the teachings of pious people, because of the mind, it's very much about the sort of mind-body relationship. And there are many people who would say that Ibn Sina, Avicenna ignored or paid less emphasis on the mind-body relationship. He was much more of a materialist in the way that he was looking at his medicine. But Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah was probably a little bit less of a materialist, but certainly much more into the mind-body relationship. But he was also someone who would look at holy texts and see what they had to say about medicine, and then that would become sort of part of his faith healing prescription. Have complete trust and confidence in God, and endure patience and accept with contentment his decrees. That's also a quote there. One of the perhaps best known critics of Ibn Sina, of course, was Al-Ghazali. And Al-Ghazali famously writes this book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And there's a riposte to this written by a different philosopher, scientist called Ibn Rushd, but I won't go into that now. And Al-Ghazali takes issue with the whole series of statements that Ibn Sina makes. And again, they're not contemporaneous, so the interesting thing is that we think they happen in real time, but these are after people have long passed. Ghazali, of course, is a huge figure in the Islamic world and in the Western world in many ways amongst philosophers. He starts his sort of journey probably in the same mold as Ibn Sina does. He's more of a rationalist, materialist. And then he has some kind of epiphany. We don't really know why. Some people speculate that it was a nervous breakdown, that he just became mentally really unwell. But he goes away, and he's not to be seen. And then he comes back a really strident critic of the materialists, and he really lays it into them. And his biggest criticism of Ibn Sina is that, because Ibn Sina is also, the one thing I missed out, he's also known as a deist, which is this idea that yes, there is a God, but God, but the role of God is not to interfere in your daily life. This is, maybe a way of thinking about it is, this is God, the chairman of the company, as opposed to God, the chief operating officer. So God does not micromanage, but God just sort of sets the stage and sets a strategy and then walks away and then kind of lets you get on with it. And because of that, it gives you human agency. It allows you to make decisions, to decide what you want to do today, tomorrow, next year, and it gives humans control over their lives. And it's a very old idea. These days it's called deism, and it's very likely that Ibn Sina was in the deist tradition. And I think that Al-Ghazali, this was like a really major problem. And he writes in The Incoherences of Philosophers, so you believe in God, so he's not questioning or doubting that Ibn Sina believes in God, but you kind of leave little point for God. You know, and this is it's a question which I think deists struggle with, is that, for example, what is the point of praying? You know, someone believes in God and they want to pray, but you don't think that God has the ability, but he doesn't necessarily want to act in a very micromanaging kind of way. Then what is the point of God? And unfortunately, of course, these debates were happening. Ibn Sina had long died, and he wasn't there to respond. But Al-Ghazali kind of gets the last word. And my sense is that it's not so much my sense. I think it is the reality that view, of course, continues to prevail, and of course, not only in the Islamic tradition, but across the monotheistic faith traditions as well. So there we are. I seem to have doubled up my slides somewhat. So Ibn Sina had kind of, some supporters, a lot of critics in the Islamic world. He also had loads of critics in Europe. Again, if you're interested in this, do read Nancy Saraisi, because she's got some amazing, there are lots and lots of commentaries, because this book was published and republished, and it's in so many libraries and in so many archives, that the commentators from that period in Western Europe, where it was being used in medical schools, they've written in the margins their little commentaries, and so she's collected together some of the kind of choice quotes, and this is one of my favourite ones, which is that Leonard Fouche is himself a medic and himself a commentator, and really, like a lot of people in Western Europe at the time, having this sort of real kind of almost bipolar moment where on the one hand they can't deny that this is a book which really works, and it's got some extremely useful knowledge, but it comes out of this worldview and system which clearly they have a problem with, as he does, taken from this quote. Another one quoted in Nancy Saraisi is the idea that and just looking at that text, it just gives you a sense straight away that which is the ancient tradition and which is the modern tradition. Symphorian Champier clearly thinks that Islam is beyond the pale. It's just the traditional way is the way that he was brought up in, and then this sort of new way is somehow the problem. And it just sort of shows you which was the older tradition and which was the more modern tradition. So in a way, Ibn Sina was fighting kind of almost on both fronts. He was fighting traditionalists within his own communities, but he was also fighting the traditionalists when his book was translated. But it's had a long shelf life, and it continues to be used. If anyone here studies or has any access to Unani medicine, to herbal medicine, then that is principally the reason why the canon of medicine is still in print, because across the world, within the Unani, the Greek/herbal tradition, this is still the main textbook, because its prescriptions are now used in that way. And I think, in a way, if Avicenna would have been alive today, I think he'd probably be turning in his grave, because he was not someone who regarded himself as a traditionalist, but certainly that's how his book has ended up. And these are just some slides of just sort of showing how the name Ibn Sina or Avicenna is used today. So it's often seen in hospitals. If you travel around the Islamic world, you will find a hospital which is named after him. I should have labeled where these are. These are all just different buildings in different places. This one, I believe, is in Iraq. This one is somewhere in the GCC, in the UAE country, in one of the UAE countries, possibly Abu Dhabi. These are all Ibn Sina hospitals. There are lots of postage stamps for the stamp collectors amongst you, all different postage stamps around him. This is a mountain peak, which is it's called the Ibn Sina Mountain, and it's on the borders of Tajikistan and I believe Uzbekistan. Anyone know what that is? Apart from the fact it looks like a slightly old man. It's a robot. probably not a great use of his name, but this is a robot made, I believe, in Saudi Arabia, and the designers of this robot in this robotics laboratory decided they'd dress him up. It's a Middle Eastern man from the 12th century, and they called him the Ibn Sina robot. But there you are. They should read my book, say more about him. This is where he's buried by. He's buried in Iran, in Hamdan these days. That's his mausoleum. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about, so we talked about one sort of scientist slash physician, and I want to talk a little bit about Al-Mamun, the patron. And again, because this also takes us in lots of different directions, and some of them really quite, ones that we perhaps wouldn't expect. So this is, he's from the Abbasid family, rules for 20 years, 13 to 33. He is known across the world especially he's been dubbed by historians as the Caliph of Science, and that's because a lot of activity is happening in his fairly brief 20 years. He's one of the early rulers to establish the role of chief scientific advisor in the court, and so he has an eminent scientist in his court who he calls on for any number of things, not necessarily just scientific questions. He realized that he needs people who are clever and who can think and who have read a lot. And so he appoints Al-Khwarizmi. Who's heard of Al-Khwarizmi here? Any mathematicians? Who is one of the discoverers or the developers of algebra. Al-Mamun is also someone who builds a lot of libraries. The most famous one, of course, called the House of Wisdom. He initiates something called the translation movement, which is trying to get knowledge from all over the world and translating it into Arabic. Knowledge from India, knowledge from the Latin world, knowledge from other languages. And of course, he builds observatories himself. He's also very hands-on. He likes to do science as much as to fund it and to employ scientists. And so one of the experiments that he himself is involved in is to measure the Earth's circumference. Jim Al-Khalili, who is a British physicist and did a 3-part television series which is connected to my book, and which is available on YouTube, incidentally, if anyone wants to. If you just type in YouTube Islam and Science and Jim Al-Khalili, you'll get the series. He tried to recreate the experiment that Al-Mamun did in the early 800s, and they discovered that he was a little bit out, but he was probably 1 or 2 percentage points out. It was a pretty good effort. And he was, of course, again, like Ibn Sina, very, very rationalist, but probably more so. And in a slightly more dangerous sense, because Ibn Sina was one man, with the power that, one individual has. Al-Mamun was a ruler, and a very rationalist ruler. And of course, this had quite profound consequences for everybody else. So in his last year, maybe 832, he was trying to encourage all the mosques and all the Islamic centers, the madrasas, to teach the philosophy or the school that later Ibn Sina would espouse. But this was this kind of form of Islamic rationalism, not believing in miracles, not believing in bodily resurrection, and so on and so forth. But of course, people weren't doing that because, if you're a very religious, very devout person, you're not being told by some pesky ruler how to believe. You'll come to your own understanding of what is faith and what is belief. So by the time he was coming to the end of his period, he was getting a bit fed up. And so he just rounded up all the jurists, not only the lawyers, but also the judges and the leaders of faith, and told them all to make appointments with their provincial governors and to swear on oath that the Quran is, to cut a very long story short, a form of human creation. Many agreed under duress because they did not want to face the consequences. A few of them did not, and one that has been quoted in the literature it's quite an amusing exchange between the governor and the jurist. The governor is basically repeating what Mamun has asked him to do. He says, "What do you say about the Quran?" The jurist goes, "It's God's speech." So the governor goes, "That's not my question. I want you to tell me, is it created?" And the jurist replies, "God created everything." And the governor goes, "But is the Quran such a thing?" And the jurist goes, "Yes." So the governor goes, "Well, so it's created then." And the jurist finally goes, "It isn't a creator." I mean, they're just playing word games because the jurist doesn't want to he doesn't want to go against the belief that he thinks is the right one. At the same time, he doesn't want to get on the wrong side of the ruler because he thinks he's going to get in trouble, and so he's sort of playing these very elaborate word games. One of the most famous victims of the Islamic Inquisition of the early 9th century is this man here. Who's heard of him? Yes, more of you. That's right. He is, one of the regarded these days as the, kind of leaders of the Islamic canon, and he got wound up in all of this. And of course, even at that stage, he was extremely well known. He refused. He just wouldn't play games. He just said, "Look, it isn't my belief." He said in the transcripts that have come to us, what we do know is that he said, "Look, you have every right." He said to Mamun and his representatives, "Because you have every right. You're the ruler. You can make whatever law, but you cannot force me to say something that I don't believe in." And this word of this got to the ruler, and Mamun was so fed up. He ordered him to be arrested. He had him flogged, and then but he still wouldn't budge. And so Mamun then starts to travel, because they're in two different places, and he starts to travel to basically to deal with him himself personally. He goes, because he felt that he just didn't want the longer that Ibn Hanbal stays as someone who is openly defying. Of course, they didn't have mass media, but word still spreads. He just felt that he didn't want him to be a sort of poster boy for what he regarded as a more aggressive way of thinking. So he just gets on his horse, gets a little army together, goes, "I'm going to sort him out myself." And on the way, he dies, which for all the supporters of Ibn Hanbal and for all of their descendants and those who follow in the Hanbali school today is sort of divine retribution. It's just evidence that the more rational way of thinking was the wrong way, and Ibn Hanbal was in fact the guardian of the correct and true way, and God just punished Mamun by having him die along the way. So just to end, a few kind of observations really. I mean, I spend a lot of my in my day job, my working life. I look at the relationship between science and empires and money and business and so on. And it's kind of interesting how patronage was so important. I think it's really interesting how then and now, just sort of comparing and contrasting how laws were made. These days, those of you who work in science, you have myriad legal protections to be able to do what you want to do. You don't have the state breathing down your neck. And in a sense, that used to happen then, to some degree. There were common languages, there was borderless travel, and a lot of discovery and invention was the result of just societal needs, whether it was wars, whether it was the need to stay healthy, or whether it was just simply, people's, particularly rulers' sort of personal interests. There's a list of further reading and sources. Mustafa, if you want to circulate the slideshow, then people can get hold of that. And this is my own book in its second edition, which you're most welcome to get as well. Thank you.
We're going to start with the Q&A sessions. We have some questions already online in the forms. If you want, you can still send them in. But Mr. Masood asked for questions from the audience first, in real life. So if there's anyone, just
Who's going to be
stand
brave?
up.
Who's going to be brave?
Or are we going with the wave method? Anyone?
No, or should we go straight with the...
I think we should go straight with the questions online.
Yeah, questions online, okay.
I'll just give it to you. And
Okay, all right. So in no particular order. Oh wow, okay. The questions are all coming in. So let's see. Am I pronouncing this right? Ehsan
yes.
says, how do you know? I don't know, is the answer. How do you know that the source of information on the internet or books about the relationship between Islam and science is the truth? Because there is so much information out there. That is a really good question, actually. It's a really good question. And so in my case, I have very basic Arabic. I've got slightly better Urdu, and I've got a little bit of Persian. So I have some of the languages. But what I did when I was writing the book was that I mostly referred to primary sources, which is there are roughly 3 to 4 big manuscript libraries in the Islamic world, plus the national archives of the former colonial powers. So there's a great archive, for example, in this country for. Closer there, all right. There's a great archive here, for example, of Indonesian manuscripts, which is held by the Dutch National Library System. Similarly, in Britain, they have archives, from Egypt, from India, and then you had the archives of Cairo, of Istanbul, of Damascus, which are now not so accessible. So I was able to access the scholars who are working in those archives, and then they gave me access to their material. And so most of what I've written, and in fact it isn't just me, but most of the books that have been written, and there are many, many books, are based on those sources. The problem, and I think this is the question that Ehsan is referring to, is that how do you know? And I think that's a really good question, and it's a very difficult one to answer. Because if your principal way of finding things out is the internet or Wikipedia, then it is not so easy to discern what the original is. My one bit of advice would be to read my book or other books as well. But the reason being is that if you want to go into more depth and more detail, what the more basic books do is they give you you need to kind of know who the principal actors were, who the main cast of characters that we know. Because once you know the names and you're familiar with those names, then you can go into the primary material and then figure out stuff that even I wasn't able to find and so on. So I think getting that basic cast of characters, the nomenclature, the characters, some of the terminology and so on, I think is quite useful. But then immediately to go to the primary source. Now, there is one website that I would recommend. I didn't write it on here. It's a website that's curated by working philosophers, by professional philosophers around the world. I haven't looked at it for about a year, but it's called muslimphilosophy.com. And even though it looks extremely basic, these are mostly people who are quite elderly, but they've decided they want to put as much of the material they have, and many of them have manuscript material. They've decided to put it on the web, they've annotated it, they've described it, they've summarized it, and there's a list of, it's just an amazing resource, and I found it really, really, really handy. So muslimphilosophy.com, if it still exists. Can someone go online and have a look, actually, while we're there?
Yes, it's still.
It's still there?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Does anyone want to follow up on that? Any other follow-up?
We have a little shy audience.
Okay. Next one. So there's a bunch of questions that are similar. So, is Ibn Sina a Muslim because of his vision about God? That's one. Are Islamic rationalists Muslim because one of the rules of the belief is to believe in Almighty God, which means miracles are possible? Another one, as far as I understand, Ibn Sina and Ma'mun were not Muslims because they were very rational. So yeah, those three are kind of quite similar. So here's the kind of interesting thing: is that first of all, it is absolutely not for me to judge, and I don't think it's up to any of us to judge, who is or isn't something. I think these days we all self-identify. We're living in a very in an age where we all profess multiple identities, and I think if someone is identifying as something, then it certainly isn't for me to make that call or to make that judgment. That's kind of my own personal point. I think there's a broader point, which is just one about time, and that is that back in older times, there seemed to be a lot more space for what today in English we would call heterodoxy, and I think it's an interesting debate to have as to why that was the case. But there seemed to be more space for, and of course, if you think about heterodoxy, it started at the point of the death of the Prophet, because one group wanted to bury him, and another group said, no, we need to elect a leader. And that was the kind of the beginnings of the fissure between the Shia and the Sunni constituencies. And then the Sunnis continue to divide and the Shias continue to divide. And there are divisions to this day. It's a completely natural progression in any belief system for there to be constant divisions. And I think so, rather than everybody sort of try and rewind the clock back and say, well, why can't we all be like it was in the 6th century? Hello, in the 6th or 7th century, there were also divisions. And I think it's probably more about learning to live with difference. To my mind, that is probably more of a priority. How do we do that? And for reasons that I am not an expert in, there seemed to be a greater, at least I think, there was a greater willingness to be able to live with difference. Not everybody. Then perhaps we do now. Do the questioners want to come back? Oh yes, on the audience, yeah.
I have a question.
Okay, let's see if we can get this to you, because then everyone can hear. You can do it. Yeah.
So you said, can everyone hear me? Yes. So you said earlier that Imam al-Ghazali sort of had the last word in his book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. But after that book, there was another book that Ibn Rushd wrote, The Incoherence of Incoherence.
Say that louder, yeah.
But it didn't become that popular, and it was sort of ignored by the Islamic world, if I may say it like that. And what do you believe is the greatest reason for Ibn Rushd's ideas to be ignored by the Islamic world?
Okay, so your question there. That's also been asked here. It's in the one of the ones. Let me see if I can find it. So in a way, the question you're asking here, there's another one here. Why has the Western world taken the lead in science and developments? And what do you think about the future of science in the Islamic world? So I'll kind of tie those two together. I always, again, I think these are really hard questions because we have a record of the material, but these days when you're doing that kind of historical research, what is the impact of something, then you have a lot more material to judge that impact by. You have newspaper articles, you have audio archives, you have television and video archives. Then you've got letters and correspondence and all the material that makes for archive historical research. So now, when we're looking at that period, all we have is manuscripts, and if we're lucky, we might have some annotations next to them. But we don't have that sense, so it's really difficult to form to accurately answer the questions that you're posing. So, for example, there is a view, and I think this is what many people think is that Ghazali made his point, and then Ibn Rushd came back, and then there was some kind of great conflagration, and Ghazali was 0 and Ibn Rushd was 1, and then this some kind of ping pong. And I think to my mind, another way of thinking about this is that who here has read Richard Dawkins, for example? Remember Richard Dawkins? He's an English writer on science and religion. He's extremely skeptical of religion. He has really strong views about things, and his books are very widely read, and they're very, very influential. But it would be difficult to argue, for example, that the books of Richard Dawkins have had some kind of major impact on society in a way that it's changed the minds of millions of people, because even in our day and age, it's difficult to trace that kind of impact. So I know it sounds like I'm kind of fudging your question or not answering properly. I just don't think that I have the apparatus or the evidence to say. Certainly there were some very deep-seated and very argumentative debates between these philosophers. But from what I know, arguments between academic experts generally don't move mountains. There are other factors, often economic factors, military factors, disease, war. If you read Jared Diamond, an American biologist, who's written a couple of books. One's called Guns, Germs, and Steel. Another one's called Collapse. And he tries to pull together what existing evidence we have as to why civilizations change and why some things collapse and some things rise. but his books don't cover the period that we're talking about. I think he goes into other kinds of detail. So, my sense is that I don't think a debate between philosophers led to, the demise of Islamic civilization. I think there were lots of other factors. There were economic factors and there were military factors. Wars usually bring governments down. When the whole story, for those of you who follow the Ottoman period, that's very much a state which became militarily, among other things, it became militarily quite weak. And there was lots of internal dissent. So on top of that, if there were then also philosophers who were having a big argument, then that might be a factor. But I think there were bigger factors too. Should we go back to the questions? Oh my God, they're all coming in. Right. Do you think religion and science can go together when conducting research in modern times? This is from Barris. I think yes and no. One of the greatest examples of this question is the 1979 Nobel Prize, which was shared by three men. It was the Nobel Prize for the discovery of electroweak theory. It was part of the standard model of particle physics, and this sort of idea that all forces gradually are basically one force, and then there was the discovery that electromagnetism and the weak force are one force. And there were three scientists who shared the prize. One of them was Steven Weinberg, who's an American physicist, who's absolute dyed-in-the-wool atheist, hasn't got a second for any form of religion or belief. And the other one was Abdus Salam, the Muslim physicist, who traces everything in terms of his scientific development to God. He's died now, but he was that devout. He said that God gives him inspiration. He gets up in the morning, he's really excited about praying. He thinks he gets all his great ideas from spirituality and from religion, and he wouldn't be doing what he's doing without it. And they both came to the same conclusion. So I really think it's a case of horses for courses almost. And that's, I think, depends on what works for different people. On top of that, of course, it is also true that certainly from the former Islamic times, there were things in religion which drove discovery. And the best example that we know, of course, is prayer times. Prayer times were pretty inexact. Observatories were developed partly to figure out how to find accurate prayer times, and not only prayer times, but a calendar, the start and end times for the different lunar months, having a lunar calendar. I think that was important. And then the idea, what's always fascinated me is that the mosque always had a space for a resident astronomer. Okay, we're talking pre-telescope, so they weren't using telescopes, they were using other instruments. But if you had a big mosque in your city, more often than not, there would be an astronomer sitting there doing that. And so clearly, that was an example of discovery that was driven by the needs of belief, the needs of faith. What have we got? What has been the impact of the loss of libraries in the Islamic world? Whoa, okay, all coming in. Loss of libraries in the Islamic world, like the one in Baghdad and Cordoba, on the science developments in the Islamic world. I think more than libraries. I couldn't answer that question, but to my mind, I think either more than libraries or as much as libraries. I think colonization was a disaster colonization is a disaster for indigenous forms of learning, not necessarily just Islamic learning. But I think, if your country is forcibly taken over by another power, and you have to learn a whole new language, and you have to start from zero, and then there's a kind of willful destruction of your own history or heritage or language, then that obviously stunts your development. And we've seen that happen in Indonesia, we've seen it in India, we've seen it in wherever there is evidence of colonization. Yes, undoubtedly some good things have come, but there has also been a willful, how can I put it, end to what might have been. We cannot say what might have happened in these countries because whatever indigenous forms of learning were happening were stopped. And I think that is by far the greater, to my mind at least, the greater issue. Anyone in the audience? Do you want to come in? Wow, this is the world of the chatbot, isn't it? Okay.
Day and age, yeah.
I know, but the trouble is I can't hear them. You can't have a conversation. Who is to blame for the fact that when we say science, people think Newton and Einstein and not the Arabic names? That's a good question. But I don't think we should be surprised that when history is a highly political subject, when you study history in school, wherever you go, I was a little late coming here because I was on an assignment in Pakistan, and there's a big debate going on about changing their history. They keep changing the history teaching in the schools there, because there's a new government and they want to emphasize certain people and they don't want to emphasize other people. So likewise, wherever you go, this idea that somehow history is some sort of pristine, apolitical thing, of course, isn't true. So wherever you learn your history, it is governed by the politics of the day. And right now, we're in an age where Newton and Einstein are very important, and so we'll learn more about them, and we'll learn less about others. The interesting thing is, though, that there was an exhibition in London a few years back at the Royal Society, which is the UK's National Science Academy, and they have they've got an amazing archive, and they paid a couple of archivists to spend some time looking in their archives to see what do they have from Arabic. Are there any Arabic manuscripts in the archives of the Royal Society? And they found them, and they found people. They didn't find Newton so much, but people of roughly that kind of ilk. So Robert Hooke and Boyle, and the sort of 1600, 1700 generation of scientists. They were obviously looking at Arabic manuscripts, and some of them, people like Edmund Halley, from whom you get the Comet. He was an Arabist. He read and understood Arabic, and he was writing little scrollings in his notes because he could do both languages at the same time. So I think there's a lot of unanswered questions, but it's sort of, I think at that time there was a greater willingness to acknowledge that we all stand on the shoulders of giants than maybe there is today. Let's go from the bottom. What does the Islamic faith and science say about the moon being divided into two parts? I don't know. Can anyone help that? What is the most important invention found by an Islamic scientist?
Opinion question.
Yeah, that's. What is the most important invention? I think my favorite, one of my favorites at least anyway, is heliocentrism, because it's pretty clear that Arabic and Persian, actually, speaking scientists probably got to heliocentrism before Copernicus did, but only just. I don't think it was, they were, as is often the case, science is highly competitive. At any one time, whatever field you look at even today, people are working in parallel on the same thing, and there was no difference back then. And so, there were other scientists working on heliocentrism, and there's a story narrated in a book called, if you want to write it down, Islamic Science and the Making of the European Renaissance. Islamic Science and the Making of the European Renaissance. And it's by a Lebanese-American historian called George Saliba. And he spent a lot of time in the archives of Damascus, where he found that the timekeeper in the mosque in Damascus, a man called Ibn al-Shatir, in the 1300s, maybe 1400s, he got pretty close in his material to a heliocentric view of the world. Because unlike in Christianity, Christianity resisted, or the church resisted, heliocentrism because of the idea that it violates, we humans are the most important thing, we are the apex of God's creation, everything else sort of spins around us. And Islamic theology never had that problem. So there was never a theological prohibition on other forms of thinking about astronomy and astrophysics. So George Saliba's book is great, by the way, and I love him to death. I wish he would write more, but he's getting on a bit now. This question's come up a few times. How do Islamic scholars think about evolution? Oh, yes, great question. So it depends what you mean by an Islamic scholar. the interesting thing is that when Darwin's book came out, there was quite a lot of discussion, kind of obviously globally, but a lot of the initial resistance was, of course, in England, and it's more in England, less elsewhere, but certainly in England. And there is an American historian, fortunately whose name escapes me, but who has studied Arabic reactions to evolution at the time of Darwin. And as you'd expect, it's a much more nuanced sort of picture. There was some resistance. There were a lot of people who thought there's no issue here. But over time, I think what's happened is that the narrative that has come out of the American evangelical right wing, which is highly, highly creationist, that's infected lots of other countries. Because if you look at the material that Harun Yahya produces, or the other Islamic opponents of evolution, there are lots of parallels between that narrative and the stuff that comes out of Texas and the stuff that comes out of the other South American states. And so there's a confluence of the narratives. Certainly around the time of Darwin, there wasn't kind of there wasn't really a huge debate. And of course, if you look at the two, what are we talking about when we say evolution? It has two main ideas, isn't it? One is common ancestry, and the other is descent with modification. And it's never been, it's never been the case that Muslims would have a problem with either of those things. And we now know, anyone who knows something about DNA knows that we share a lot of DNA with things that are nothing like us. Do we have evidence that the Arabs knew that the earth was not flat? God, I wish I knew. I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that one. What were the limitations of writing your book? That's such a great question. What were the limitations of writing my book? I think the biggest limitation was deadline. So deadline is important because if you don't have a deadline, you'll never get anything done. But at the same time, if you have a deadline, then you can't, you have unfinished business, which is why I'm so glad that I was able to bring out a second edition, because there was stuff that I just couldn't put in the first. So if anyone is going to spend a few pennies and buy the book, then don't buy the first edition, which is yellow, buy the second edition, which is light blue. I think my other big limitation, and I now regret this because I had an opportunity to learn Arabic properly when I was young, but I was a horribly rebellious child and I never listened to my parents. So I didn't really learn very much Arabic. And I think if I had listened to them, then I would have a better basis to read the original material, because I've read mostly in English and a little bit in French and some in German. I don't read them very well, but just by getting some help. And in fact, when the book was being translated into Arabic, I had a really interesting discussion with my Arabic editor, who she read the manuscript, and then she phoned me up and said, we'd like to publish this book, but we have a problem. And I said, what's your problem? She goes, none of my readers are going to accept that your reference to Ibn Sina is Nancy Ceresi in Italy, or that your reference to someone else is someone in Germany or someone in the United Kingdom, because we have the existing sources. And I was going, okay, so how are we going to fix this? And she goes, we're going to have to go back to your European sources and trace back the original Arabic or Persian or Urdu or Hindi manuscript. Because I won't be able, the book just won't be credible or authentic amongst an Arabic-speaking audience. So we spent a whole year doing that. And that's the kind of good news. And the bad news is that my Arabic publisher just thought the book was a bit beyond the pale, and they didn't like it, and so they pulled the plug. So the Arabic edition never saw the light of day, which is sad. If anyone's an Arabic publisher, is the book ready?
It's too early for that. We're all students.
Yeah. Can you speak loud and clear? Yes. How are we doing for time? Okay, 5 more minutes. Let's find one of these.
I think you did one more big question. That'd be great.
What is your ethnicity and what is your favorite book? Let's get personal, shall we? So my ethnicity is, my family are Urdu speaking. They were born in India. Then at the time of the partition of India, when India became two countries, half my family stayed in India, the other half moved to Pakistan. And my own family, my own parents and their generation, they migrated to the United Kingdom in the late 1950s. I was born in the UK and I've lived there most of my life. I have children who are your age, a little bit older now, so we're into our third and fourth generation. My favourite book is, I have many favourite books, but one of the best books I ever read. So before I became a journalist, I wanted to be a teacher, and I tried teaching, but I got the sack. I won't tell you why I got the sack, but I didn't get the sack. But there's an American sociologist called Neil Postman, who's now died, and he was a really interesting, very eclectic thinker. And he wrote a book, a really small book published in the US and the UK, called Teaching as a Subversive Activity. And if anyone's interested in being a teacher of any kind, a university teacher or a school teacher, go get that book. You will really enjoy it. It's called Teaching as a Subversive Activity. And it's by two authors. Neil Postman is one, and Charles Weingartner is the other. But if you Google Postman and that book, you will get it. I think it's still in print. It's one of my favourite books. Off topic. What is the easiest way to learn Persian?
It's really off topic.
Go to Iran. I guess so. There's probably a Department of Persian Studies somewhere in this country. There's probably several, so I would, I'd probably head there. What is your educational background? I'm a physicist, a failed physicist, and was I studying physics? And then I studied science communication at the master's level. I do not have a question, but I would like to thank you for your time and your interesting lecture. Well, that's a great way to end on, I think so. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your time. We also have a little bit of a gift basket for you.
Thank you very much.
There are lots of good stuff in it.
Thank you.
I'll tell you more about it later. But everyone, thank you for coming tonight. If you want, you can still sign up for a membership with our association. Otherwise, I wish you a safe trip home and good evening.